Guys, Alf, it's happening! There has been a massive video game collection, probably the most valuable video game collection that has been ever found. It is now to be identified as the DFW Collection Pedigree, and it consists of 166 mostly sealed games, about 90% of them being sealed games. We're going to talk about why this is good news for video game collectors and why this might be bad news for video game collectors, especially maybe some of the high-end owners of games already. We will speculate and talk through this. Stick around. What is going on, Collectibles friends? We are back again with another video. A lot of comic book talk on this channel, but we also do talk about video game collecting / speculating / investing in quotation marks as well. And there is some massive news. We actually reported in a video a few days back, there was a $90,000 sale for a very rare sealed hang tab Castlevania game, the original one from the NES, one of my all-time favorite games. Hit me all in the feels and a great story. Minus Worlds bought that one. And there was also a Kid Icarus game, a sealed Kid Icarus game, that these things magically floated up onto eBay. And a lot of video game collectors were like, what is going on? These are legitimate games, but why are they on eBay and not at, Heritage or not at some of these larger auction houses? And they're not graded. They're ungraded sealed games. And so I found this full story on collect.com. So I have to give credit here. CLLCT.com wrote about this, kind of gave a little bit more color to this story. I thought that it was just really interesting. And so how this thing happened, and again, this is kind of one of those situations where we're all like, man, if I could go back in a time machine, if I could go back, I would have bought all these baseball cards. I would have bought all these comic books and video games. Well, essentially, these guys, going back to the 80s, they were already in their 60s, had the foresight to buy up a bunch of games. They were buying multiples of these original NES games and Sega games and so forth, and of course, opening some of them to play, but keeping tons and tons of sealed games and just collecting them, hoarding them over time. And sadly, their estate, after they passed away, these guys were in their 60s, going back to the 80s. After they passed away, their estate sold off, not understanding the values behind these games. And so the consignor now, which all this stuff is going to heritage auctions this summer, the consignor now, the lucky person that found this estate sale, I don't know what sort of a bargain deal he or she got on this, but I assume that they're probably doing pretty well if the original owners just didn't have any idea about values. And so he or she has these and sold a couple on eBay. And like I said, we're talking about a huge price for a sealed video game. There's been a lot of talk here recently over the last couple of years about how it's a BS market. No one spends actual money. These are shill bids. No one's actually buying these games for six figures or 50,000 or whatever it is. It's just a cabal of people that are controlling the pricing and this, that, and the other thing. Well, it turns out there actually are longtime collectors that will spend serious money on games. And we're going to get a huge test of this as Heritage is literally going to put these in. I think they're all going in the summer auction. So there's going to be a big summer Heritage auction where there's over 150 titles that are sealed games. I don't know if they will be graded beforehand or how that's going to all go down, or if they're just going to be sold as is, sealed. But it is going to be a monstrous sale. Some of the other games that are going to be part of this are an early sealed copy of Legend of Zelda, Contra, one of my all-time favorite games, which is going to be early first print sealed copy, and many of the early Sega games. Another thing that was recently announced, just probably as equally as big news as this, is VGA, the original gaming grading company, going back 15 or 16 years, they have released a population report. And the one thing that stood out to me here is I saw this on Greg the Games. He had kind of a breakdown of this population report. You would think after 15 years of grading games that this would be a pretty robust population report. And it's really not. I mean, yes, they've graded some games more than others, but when I compare to trading cards and comic books and a lot of the other stuff, we're talking about a very new market in that sense, as far as third-party grading is concerned with these retro, these original vintage video games. I think it's hilarious, the vintage video games. As I grew up with the vintage NES, original NES video games. It's kind of cool to think that I was a kid during kind of the beginnings of what has become a massive, massive industry. And so VGA has come out with their population report. And also keep in mind, I know for a fact, just from following the groups, a lot of games that were in VGA holders have been cracked out and sent to WADA or CGC to be graded. So we look at that population for VGA, you might think, oh, they've graded 100 copies of this. How many of those are still in the VGA holder? And then how many of those have been crossed over to either WADA or CGC? I think it's a fair amount. I think it's a pretty decent percentage. Not saying it's like 75%, but I wouldn't be surprised at all if it was 20 or 25% of the overall VGA graded games, just being the rise of WADA and CGC, and just kind of how VGA is kind of clunked along, a solid grading company, but just hasn't been in the news kind of in a similar fashion as Beckett, BCBS on the comic side, and Beckett for trading cards just kind of fell behind over the last few years during these pandemic years where we had the explosion. VGA is kind of that company that didn't really keep up with the other companies that were really kind of making waves in the graded video game space. Now, the one thing that stands out to me here is supply. I talk a lot about this on the channel on the comic book side. Man, there's just a lot of ungraded supply out there. Am I in a big hurry to go get that key book? Am I in a huge hurry to go get that sealed video game or the CIB game? I'm not so sure. I think it really depends. I'm picking my spots, but I'm not here to say that there's going to be finds like this often because I really don't think that there are. It's a lot different to be in the 80s and buying $30, $40, $50 video games in multiples and keeping them sealed. I mean, look, trading cards were meant to be collected, back then, going back 50, 60, 70 years, they've been collected. And so, video games were never collected. They were never collected in that way. And they were a lot more expensive. Trading card packs were 50 cents, $1, in the 80s, so it's a different ball game. I don't think that there's going to be a lot of, collections of these sealed games that come out. What I think could be more of a vulnerability to this sort of supply is simply a, Toys R Us, surplus somewhere, or a KB Toys, in a warehouse somewhere randomly, probably not the case. There's probably not a ton of black box NES games that are sealed in an underground bunker somewhere or some sort of warehouse lost somewhere. Probably not, but you never know. So it's actually more of just unused supply or unsold supply that's just somewhere in the world that could come out. That would be my concern when it comes to video game populations and then it becoming graded over time. Of course, if you spent big money on the first releases, the first prints of these particular games, it doesn't take much to affect those prices. So if there's a population of 5, sticker seal, first print games, and then another 20 hits the population, that's not a lot in the grand scheme of things, but it is a lot when you're paying, X amount of dollars because there's only a handful of these in the world that you think, and then 20 more show up or 50 more show up. We've seen that being the big vulnerability with pop culture collectibles as a whole, especially a lot of stuff that was produced in the 80s and the 90s. They produced a lot of this stuff in the 80s and the 90s. It's just with games, what's unique is they were meant to be played. They weren't held back to be collected like that. I was there. People weren't hoarding them to collect them. They were opening them up and they were playing them because, again, you weren't spending $40 or $50 on a game to let it sit in the plastic, to put on your shelf to look at it. And so very unique collectibles category, of course, associated with all the pop culture goodness that we enjoyed from the 80s and 90s. This is really big news. I'm going to follow very closely this summer that Heritage auction. I'll probably do a live viewing, a live watch as that auction ends because I want to see what these sealed games end up going for. I have heard, I think Eric, the dentist, one of the big game collectors, I saw in that article, he had commented, I think that the stress test this summer is going to be how much capital, how much money is going to show up for these games when they're all hitting kind of at the same time. Will they stagger them out? How will that work? I guess the one kind of pro to this is there's time to move money around because look, these are not going to be inexpensive games. They're absolutely not. I don't know if they're going to all sell for $90,000, $100,000 like that Castlevania or the Kid Icarus, but they're going to be significant they're going to be significant sales. And so if you are kind of one of those high-end buyers, though, you've got some time. If it's a summer auction, there's people I know right now that are probably, they got 2 or 3 months to move funds around and get ready and locked in for this auction. And it's going to be really, really fun to watch. Going to be a big day, I think, for video game collecting, because as we've said, tons of negative coverage on the video game collecting / speculating world is just being BS and is full of a bunch of losers that are just trying to encapsulate games that are meant to be played. I understand if you don't understand it, but that doesn't make it wrong, and it doesn't make it less fun for all of us that are involved in buying these artifacts. I look at these as historical pieces the same way as a vintage baseball card collector looks at that 52 Topps Mantle and they say that's the first Topps card and it's Mickey Mantle, the legend. That's exactly how I look at the original Mario Brothers for NES or these old Atari games, you know, with these first appearances of these huge pop culture icons, these characters that are now still around today and still popular, and frankly will continue on for generations because they keep on making movies, they keep on making theme parks, they keep on doing all this stuff. So all right, friends, let me know your thoughts in the comments. Are you diving in to get these games in the summer? Are you curious to see what they go for? Do you think that there's going to be a liquidity problem? Meaning, do you think that sales are going to suffer based on other sales? Like someone's like going hard on the Legend of Zelda first print, and so it's going to affect the Metroid first print. What are your thoughts? Let me know in the comments below. Stay healthy, stay awesome, and I will talk to you again later.